Comrades and siblings, this is a report by the People's Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Inject a little humor here. I do want to announce just before I start that anyone who could make the next MTA board meeting, which is Thursday, February 22nd at 9 a.m. at 2 Broadway. That's right where that bullshit bull statue is, you know, yeah. And the woman confronting it, the young woman. And also, we have a flyer. If people could manage to get some of these flyers and distribute them, it would be good. Now, I was asked to speak on the taxi perspective in relation to transportation workers. Whether you drive a bus, you work in the subway, you drive a taxi, you're workers. So let me just say this. I had a production meeting that I do up at Sage on 27th Street. And just to give you an example of what disability access is like on buses for disabled people, be they use crutches, a wheelchair, and especially in the winter, it's almost a question of survival for disabled people, especially those who are using wheelchairs. I'll give you a quick example. The two priority buses on 14th Street are the 14A and the 14D. The 14D runs in packs of 3, not right next to each other, you know, like maybe 5 minutes apart. I never get on the first one. Once in a blue moon, or rarely, I get on the second one. Usually it's the third one. So in other words, accessibility is not equal, which is what we want. Oh, by the way, tonight, I couldn't even get on the third one. I had to wait for the next cycle, and guess what? The first bus of the next cycle, forget about it. The second one, I managed to get on. So that was the 5th bus while I was in that bus stop. Can you imagine? 5. And of course, some of these buses are so crowded. The 14D, perhaps even more than the A. I might also point out that we've come up with this term about gentrifying public transportation. The 14D, if I had to sum up the entire route, serves mostly people of color, people who live in projects, the oppressed, poor people, right? That service is not the same as those who are on the Upper East Side. I can tell you that right now. The question with dealing with disabled access is multi-layered. I'll give you a few examples. You're in your wheelchair. It's 12 degrees outside. The wind is like, 20 miles an hour, it can be more. And the bus comes, there's no room. Even if you're in a wheelchair, the bus can be packed. I mean, literally like sardines. Now you wait for the next bus. Meanwhile, some vehicle or street work inhibits the bus from pulling over to the curb, lowering the ramp, and taking your wheelchair. Sometimes, you know what people in wheelchairs will actually do? If they can, they will actually take their chair to another bus stop where there isn't vehicles that, pull over. Sometimes people in wheelchairs go out into the street, which is dangerous, just to get on a bus. If they don't get on a bus and it's 11 degrees out, don't forget, you're sitting in the chair. You're not even moving around. You get colder way faster than able-bodied people. I just wanted to point that out. Now, let's talk about the taxi industry. Now, I started driving a taxi for 26 years in 1972. At that time, we actually had a union that had eyeglass plan, vacation plan, and whatnot, until the industry slipped into serfdom. Okay? That's basically what happened, where workers now had to pay to rent their cab. Involuntary servitude, basically. When that happened, the industry became more desperate. At that point, until 2004 or 5, there were 12,800 taxis in New York City. Unfortunately, many of those taxis did not serve oppressed communities. They did not. It's just an unfortunate truth. Of course, now that certainly at least 90% of the taxi driver workforce are people of color. Mostly of them, immigrants. Most taxi drivers do a 14-hour day. They basically work 2 7-hour shifts. You go to your garage, you throw in your hack license, usually you're going to shape up at least an hour. Couple that with now having to turn in, you have to go through a whole process. Basically, it's a 14-hour day. So people say, well, why are you working 12 hours? Well, because you're not being paid by percentage of your trips anymore, right? You're not going out and getting a $10 fare and you make $5 for yourself on your first fare. You have to take in $130, $140 before you make a dime for yourself. The fleet owners love it. Guaranteed profit. They know exactly what they're going to make. Macy's department store doesn't even know what profit they're going to make tonight. So what has happened that has now perpetuated into another problem? Massive layoffs that have been going on for years. Workers have become unemployed. They've been attracted to things like Uber or Lyft. And it's very understandable. I also might add, though, that in the outlying districts, East New York, Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Bushwick, people of color are actually getting served. This has to be conceded. I mean, this has to be said. In Manhattan, it's a different story. Here's the deal. In 2005, Bloomberg increased 1,200 medallions to from 12,600 approximately to 13,800. That's a way of the city generating revenue. And then, as we all know, approximately 4 years ago, Uber and Lyft came onto the scene. The last thing we want to see is workers at each other's throat. Uber has tried to undercut the taxi industry by having lower prices. Now. Except when there was, remember the explosion over here in Chelsea? What was that, last year sometime? Right after that, Uber doubled the rates in this area immediately. Talk about exploitation. So now if you take, okay, let me also point this out to you for your benefit. All Ubers and Lyfts and other ones like it, I don't know the names of all of them, but those are the two main ones. They all have at the end of their license plate a C. Taxis don't have it. They have T's. Now, the C's used to be for car services and maybe, you know, black cars, right? Which all are becoming diminished because of the competition from Uber. But the Uber and Lyft drivers are basically at each other's throats. Why? I'll tell you why. There's periods of time like in the late 80s when I can tell you that there was probably one taxi for every 3 fares. So, you know, you went out, you made your money. Now, if you count taxis, Uber, Lyft, you're probably talking about a dozen cars for 1 fare. All right? What does that mean? It means that Uber really exploits these people because they're so desperate for any fare that comes along. Of course, you know, the only big difference between a yellow taxi driver and an Uber and a Lyft is, and I don't mean this to be insulting, please understand, taxi drivers do have to go through orientation, you have to take courses, you know, at least to get you started, while Ubers are unregulated, well, some workers would say amateurs. I don't mean that in a desecrating way. So what has happened is this. If you take taxi, Uber, Lyft, and combine them with taxis, it's not 13,800. It's more like now 119,000. Okay? So there's way more wheels for the fares that want the wheels. This has led to a decline in wages for all the workers. Taxi, Uber, Lyft, it doesn't matter. I myself know taxi drivers working tonight. You know where they go home? You know where their home is? It's the back seat of the cab. They got their toothpaste and their clothes in the trunk. That's how bad it's gotten. People have lost their homes. Seriously. And many have actually, if they're not homeless, they're on the edge of homelessness. And there's no regulation of it. It's really taking workers and put them in such a state of desperation that they work sometimes even longer hours. I know taxi drivers, you know what they do? They work double shifts. Not every day, but they work double shifts. They work easily over 100 hours a week. By the way, a double in the taxi industry is 24 hours. Just imagine a shift like that. So, what is really needed is a protracted, organized, comprehensive movement to fight the MTA and, how should I call it, the authority figures of transportation, the bosses. So, if I can just add this, we went last night to this MTA thing at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, where they're very skillful. they have these, they have like, I don't know how many people they have, but like maybe 25 people who are constantly rotating in front of a diagram of some kind. And I can tell you, most of it is absolutely ludicrous. Like two-way bike lanes right alongside each other on a one-way street. Now, I used to work in the bicycle industry as well. I was a bike leader for American youth hostels. I rode about 10 to 11,000 miles a year before I was no longer able to, right? That's how much I rode a bike. And now, what you have is a situation where they are creating, let me just say this to you, I don't have the time to go into it all. This L train shutdown, which frankly I believe is a prerequisite, what they want to do is standard operational procedure, condition people to believe there is no alternative, and that this advisory, I forget their name, maybe somebody could correct me, they come out about every 25 years with a proposal. And the last one, which they came out with about 11 days ago, was the idea of shutting down mass transit completely from midnight to 5 a.m., right? And they're using this L-line shutdown, which no one can convince us has to be completely shut down. I mean, remember, they're talking about Hurricane Sandy. And they're talking about this project being completed by 2022. Isn't that 10 years after Sandy? Well, how did they manage all these years? Now, what it tells you is that at the very least we would give them is that they could stagger the trains. It is going to be literally a nightmare even getting here to a meeting. No private cars on 14th Street. Parking, forget about it. And let me say one last thing about shutting down the subways and buses 12 to 5. Do I hear layoffs of transit workers if you eliminate 5 hours of operation? Wouldn't you reasonably conclude that that would be one of their results and the objectives, in fact? So, let's just say that the work of PMTA, which we're not even that old, I mean, when we started, like in the summer, is getting a reputation. We did a mic check at that meeting last night. Well, it's not a meeting. The reason why they have it is so that you can't dominate the meeting by like going in with a loudspeaker. We did a mic check, but basically and they've done this in Brooklyn too. They divide up so that you have a handful of people here, a handful of people there, and there's no connection. Well, maybe let me just leave it at that, and remind people we do have this leaflet. We have the MTA board meeting Thursday, February 22nd at 9 a.m. And there's the court. We have support the lawsuit to get elevators in the subway station as directed by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, as many of you know, is over a quarter of a century old. And then, that's Monday, March 5th at 10 a.m. at 60 Center Street. And put your antenna up for the People's MTA meeting right here, Wednesday, March 7th at 7 p.m. on this floor. Thank you.